All right. Hi, everyone. It's Elizabeth and Katie, and we are going live. Hope you're able to join us today for Page to Sound, the making of an audiobook. We're here today to celebrate Elisabeth Swan's release of her audiobook version of Picture Yourself a Leader, and also talk about behind the scenes of making an audiobook, our bloopers, and so much more. And also, we're going to be giving away some copies of our audiobooks for free to some lucky listeners. So we'll be doing that throughout the next hour. So hopefully you can join in and stay on, and there'll be great opportunities for some conversation and winning. We want to have a lot of fun. We also are going to be welcoming Brian Morris, who is Elizabeth's audio producer, here to go deep into some of the true makings of an audiobook. We'll be sharing our own stories from Picture Yourself a Leader and Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and so much more. And we welcome all of your questions. We're going to try and see them if they come up through the feed here too, whether or not you're on LinkedIn or on YouTube, although most of you, I imagine, are on LinkedIn. And if you're watching this after the live fact, please continue to put your comments in. Elisabeth and I will be monitoring the chat and coming back and responding to you. So welcome, Elisabeth Swan. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Katie Anderson. I'm so psyched to do this with you.
I am excited to do this too. When you asked me to help you celebrate the release of your audiobook, I said yes, for sure. And for some of you might not know, Elisabeth and I go back really connected in the journeys of writing both of our books. When I was working on Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn back in 2019, pre-pandemic, Elisabeth served on my editorial board and I'm really grateful. She read an early manuscript and gave me some really powerful feedback. And I did the same for her a few years ago when she was working on Picture Yourself a Leader. So it really speaks to the collaboration and how we make the making of a book, and the making of an audiobook is not a simple linear journey. And it's one of growth and learning along the way, and a lot of learning from failure and mistakes too. So hold on that, because we're definitely going to come back and talk about how we've had to apply our own learnings about learning from mistakes and failures along the way as well. Elisabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you to share some things about what you're excited about, the release of your audiobook, and more.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to just the fact that we were on each other's editorial boards, and just anyone listening, I feel like, you're always going to gain from another set of eyes. And I felt like Katie felt, like she just described, hey, I got some profound feedback from Elisabeth during my editorial. And I felt like Katie altered some great things in the book. And so I feel like, once again, reaching out and collaborating and saying, hey, can you celebrate with me, Katie? It was just a natural, right? It just felt like, okay, that's something we should do. And I got to know the reason I even, was in a position to respond to Katie's initial reach out was that I got to go on a Japan study tour trip with Katie and with my good buddy, Tracy O'Rourke. Shout out to another fabulous collaborator, which was an amazing experience. And just, hey, if you're going to be on a bus going into parts unknown with a person for like a better part of a week, well, then you get to know them really well.
Yes. No, it was great. I feel like it was that we'd known each other for a year or two before that, but we really forged not only a professional relationship, but truly a personal friendship too. And so I really value that, Elisabeth, and I'm so excited for the continued collaboration and celebrating your audiobook.
Yeah.
So I'm actually not seeing any of the chat coming through. So
I see a little bit.
You do? Okay, great. So if you are listening live, please let us know where you're tuning in from. Elisabeth can read out some of those comments, and this might. And a heads up too, for the giveaway for our audiobooks. Unfortunately, it's only for US Audible listeners only, just because this is the way the QR code or the codes go that they give us. So, but we would love to celebrate the audiobook with you, other people around the world. So where are people calling in from or listening in from?
Well, I'm going to guess I see Sabrina Malter.
Hi, Sabrina.
And so I'm going to say somewhere, she's going to have to remind me of where she is in Germany.
Yes. Somewhere in Germany. And Sabrina's about to release a book too. So we're very excited for that. Sabrina, hopefully an audiobook too. You can learn from Elisabeth and my experiences and mistakes here so that you two can build upon our experience.
In German, as it were.
Yes, in German as well. So fantastic.
So I see, wow, lots of folks here. Okay. So we have Jennifer Ayers. I believe we both know Jennifer very well. She's in Portland. Chelsea Bartman is in Michigan. Brady Elliott, San Diego. Diane, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Boehm. Boehm. She's in Wisconsin. Great. Hello, Diane. Ruth Stanley, Ottawa, Canada. We
hi,
are
Ruth Stanley. Yeah.
Truly international here. And we've got Katie Mankins in Nipomo, California. Hello, Katie.
Hi.
James Eaton in Southeast Kansas. Hello, James. Oh, Vicki Merrick, a good buddy of mine from Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Hello, Vicki.
Yes.
Some hometown team. Oh, Heidelberg. Sabrina, thank you.
Yes. Okay, great. Oh, great. I see. And I found where all the quotes were. I was looking on LinkedIn, but it's on the side of our restream. So
it is if you would look to your right, Katie.
Yes, I am here. I had to click a button. So now I see with visibility everything Elisabeth is sharing. So great.
And just two other people.
Yep.
Tom Bertels, who I affectionately called Tomas, and then Pammy down in Florida, two very old colleagues of mine. And Thomas is also an author, so I suspect he's going to learn a few things too.
Yeah, great. Well, and then for those of you joining in or listening in, please share where you're tuning in from. And again, Elisabeth and I will be coming back to this chat too. So that is fantastic. Well, I'm excited for giving away some copies of the books to those of you in the US and then sharing our learning here today with those of you all around the world as well. So some of our intention is talking about, how we know each other and how we're interrelated, but also, what it means to be an author and to share your voice in many different ways. So as part of today, Elisabeth and I, when we were talking about, we're like making an audiobook or first writing a book is this huge process about really clarifying your perspective and your voice. And then recording your audiobook is a whole nother thing. But it gave us some insights on how we use our voice and how we use our voice in perspective in different ways. And so that's part of what we want to talk about too. It's not just about an audiobook, but really stepping into our authentic voice, how we share, how we collaborate, and how we learn together. But before we get into that, we want to focus on audiobooks and the celebration of Elisabeth's audiobook that's just coming out this month. So Elisabeth, let's dive into the topic of audiobooks and why even make an audiobook? I mean, it's a labor of love to even write a book in the first place. Yeah. So I have my perspective of what drove me, but let's turn it over to you. What led you to dive in to the second part of your book, which is the audio format?
Yeah, I think there's two decisions, right? There's like, should you make an audiobook, right? And then should you be the one recording it or should get someone else to record it? And the first one, I always assumed I would have an audiobook, but I just, felt like it's going to be insurmountable. And I can talk about that mistake in a bit. But the idea of reading it myself, once I was like, well, yeah, I want the audiobook, then it was, well, of course it would be me reading it. And I think that's two parts. I think one of it is, and like your book, these are stories that I lived. So I would want to tell my stories. It would seem odd to have a stranger tell my stories. No. The other aspect, and I wrote an article about it titled The Princess Seat. And that was the canoe trip where, there was an extra seat where you couldn't have a paddle and it would be called the Princess Seat. And it was kind of like, you wanted to be a paddler, right? You wanted to have some canoe chops and I didn't have them. So the more capable athletes sat in the paddling seats. And then I was bored. So somebody had brought Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I started reading aloud. And then, because it's more interesting for me, I started doing all the voices and, off with his head. So anything I could make it interesting for me. And that turned into a question of demand.
Mm.
Sort of like, can you sit in our princess seat? There were 2 canoes, and people were like, can you come over to our princess seat and read to us? And then I remember being in a lean-to, and they were like, do you have any books? Can you read to us now too? And then in cars, I don't get car sick. And I would read on long trips, which is probably like, horrifying for those that,
I get very car sick.
So not good for you, Katie. How about you? Why did you choose to do your audiobook?
That was similar thing to you. So I actually don't, even though I get very car sick, I'm not a huge audiobook consumer myself. I really, when I read, I prefer to read. And I was gifted with, as being a speed reader. I didn't train for this, but I can consume books very, very quickly.
That's right.
And so I actually can read faster than I can listen, which is, and I've actually trained myself to listen at 1.5 speed now, but anything else is too frenetic. But I knew other people. So this is not about me. This is about, my audience and connecting with a wider group of people. And I knew people like to listen to audiobooks. And so both that, so others listen to audiobooks, that's how they consume and consume books and information. And then the second, like you, why read the book myself? And I ended up doing it twice, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So you learned from some of my mistakes of the pandemic times. But because my book was so personal, I mean, it was about my relationship with Isao Yoshino, crafted over conversations over 5 years. And it didn't make sense for anyone else to read it. And, I wanted to have Mr. Yoshino's voice in there too, but it would have been too much for him to read all of the quotes that were from him. And so I realized I was the narrator of this story, both from a writing perspective, and I was the narrator of the story from an audio perspective. I did have John Shook and Mr. Yoshino record parts of theirs. They both read their, forward types of the intro and the forward. And then Mr. Yoshino has little quotes at the beginning of every chapter. So I got their voice in there as well. But that certainly it didn't make sense for such a personal experience to be read by anyone else. And I think there are good reasons for people to choose others, to read their books. But that was certainly my decision point as well.
Yeah. It's funny you raised the point of that there were other voices in your book, and there were other voices in mine. And I read them because I quoted you and other folks in our community. And I remember when I read those quotes, and Brian Morris, who's coming on soon, can reflect on this, that I often had to read them again because I had to really listen to their cadence and how they spoke, right? And so it was a little bit of, you probably did that with Mr.
Yeah,
Yoshino,
actually,
right?
I hadn't thought about this because I did mine 4 years ago, but well, twice, but yes, I was very intentional about how to shift from my talking to reading a quote from Mr. Yoshino. And so I actually tried to be, and we're going to talk about authentic voices as well, and how we had some observations about how do you actually record an audiobook so it's engaging, and that's a whole nother thing which we can get into. But I did do a tonal difference in the cadence of my speaking to kind of slow down and not be me talking and more like sharing someone else's quote or perspective. And so I tried to have, in the same way I had a visual difference in the book, all of any direct quotes from him was put in, or, I massaged the direct quotes, but, was put in italics. So there was a visual differentiation. I did the same thing in my tonality intentionally when I was recording the book as well.
Right.
Oh, interesting. But yes, it's all these things that you don't really think about. And, you and I both are podcasters, and we realize there's also a different way of doing an audiobook than from doing something like this live than to doing a podcast. So again, all the different ways we can have authenticity to our voice, but it has to match the format. So more on that later, and stay tuned. Yes. So before we go to Brian and welcome him in, I would like to do a book drawing for someone here in the US. So Brady, if you could do our wonderful, we share a wonderful assistant, Brady, and she is going to randomly draw one of the names of people who said they were in the US. So we'll announce that in a moment here. And then let me see if I can find Brian, if he's on our. So here he is, Brian Moore.
Amazing.
Brian Morris, you're here. I'm going to put you live. All right. He should be here. Here he is. Brian.
I see him, but he's a little frozen. So we'll find out if we can unfreeze Brian.
Oh,
Brian. And he looks like
Brian.
he might even be in his studio.
He does look like he's in his studio.
I am. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, but you're frozen in a strange, awkward position.
I know.
From a video.
I see that. Yeah, I see that.
But we can hear you, and that's most important. Your voice is the most important thing.
Yes, I mean, we're talking audio, right? So that's the that's the.
It would be good to have the video. I look a little weird, but yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I can. If you want to try to log back off and
sure, if you want to try and come back in, Elizabeth and I can keep bantering away for a little bit. Why don't we? Why don't we do that? I'm going to put you off. There we go. All right, Brian's going to come back, and in the meantime,
we got a winner, Katie.
Oh, we do. Who? Who is our first winner?
Our lucky winner is James Eaton.
All right. So James, if you can direct message Elisabeth on LinkedIn and share your email address, I think that's what we need to be able to share a code for you for your Audible versions of both of our books. So you get a copy of both Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and Picture Yourself a Leader. So they're very good companion books as well. I like to say story-driven and really actually perfect for audio. And so maybe that's an interesting point. So we had some offline conversations with some other colleagues like Karen Martin and Mark Graben about decision points around what types of books are really good for an audio format. And Elisabeth, I'll turn it over to you because you sort of sparked the conversation in our circle about this.
Yeah. I mean, it came up because Audible was asking me, do you have, something, a PDF you want to attach to your audiobook? And I'm thinking, well, isn't the idea that this is audio and not? And so I was reached out to Katie and Mark and Karen, all authors who have done audiobooks. And I was like, did you do this? And it brought up what Katie's talking about, which is Karen said she had done an audiobook for, I think it was Value Stream Mapping, her book with Mike Osterling. And she said it shouldn't have an audio. It needed too many visuals, right? Yes. That just didn't work. And so there was one and she's removing it. So that was interesting. And then Mark Graben had made the same decision about the
measures of success,
because that's all charts and graphs, whereas he would do an audio for Mistakes That Make Us.
Yes, and has. So, all right, Brian is back and his video is working. So Brian Morris, welcome to our LinkedIn Live. And I'm excited. Nice to meet you. And I'm excited to hear a bit about your partnership with Elisabeth. And I can share some of my experience of working with producers as well. But let's start off with Elisabeth introducing Brian and his involvement in your book.
Well, Brian, it turns out I got turned on to Brian through a couple of colleagues who work at the local Cape and Islands radio station, WCAI. And Vicki Merrick representing WCAI is on here in the LinkedIn Live, and also Vicky. Sam Brown. And I thought I was going to have to fly somewhere to find somebody who could work with me. And Brian was up the street in Mashpee, and so he said, "Want to come by and see my studio?" And I'm looking at it right now, Brian.
Yeah,
right?
That's all good soundproofing.
Where the magic happens, as they say.
Yeah, so. And that was just a great discovery, and really, really fun to go through the process with you. And I learned a ton just working with you, and you paid incredible attention to detail. I mean, I would think to myself, oh, I probably could have done that better. And you'd pipe up and go, yeah, read that again, just this section, and don't let your voice go up at the end.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned you were talking cadence a few minutes ago, and that's really a large part of it. It's just sometimes the difference in how you inflect even a single word can totally change the meaning of how a sentence comes across and can give it life, can give it some kind of shape. And I think that's what we we tried to do with some of the things that we ended up redoing, a sentence here or a phrase there, just to give it that shape, that little turn of phrase, that little emphasis on a single word that maybe you hadn't done in the prior take. And it really, it can really change things radically and bring something to life. And so that's what we, the main part of what we worked on, I think, was just cadence and pacing, of course, is really important.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty smooth ride, though, I have to say, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Yeah.
I think if I, I got like a little pat there, a little like
Yeah,
not bad.
yeah.
But I have to say there were moments where I thought when you would say read it like this, and I'd think, oh, you have a really good voice. You should probably be reading the book.
No, it's your story.
Nah, it's
No,
just
it's true.
you were fine. You were fine. You were
But
fine. Yeah.
I will come back to something I think you alluded to, Katie, which is I found myself wrestling with, you want to bring energy to it, right? You want to stay authentic, right? So how energetic is your authentic self? That's one, which both of us are fairly on the energetic side, but also just, trying to maintain your voice. And then this is, Brian brought this up. I bet you dealt with this, Katie, knowing kind of Speedy's your middle name, but that he'd say, okay, do that again, a little slower.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's another thing that makes a big difference. You can, if you run away with something just too fast, it's just all about the listener and making sure you're aware of how the listener is going to process it, and are they going to be able to process it in the right amount of time. And so pacing, I think we worked on that a fair amount, but we fell into it pretty easily. I think a good pace.
Yeah.
And it wasn't too problematic there.
Yeah. That's good. Well, so I had two different experiences, which I'll talk about in a moment. But my experience of when I went into a studio and having a producer there, outside the sound, the sound area that you're recording in, to listen in real time and give that corrective feedback was so powerful and highly more effective. It's definitely worth the investment of going into a studio to have a producer there. And I'll share my other experiences when we move into that.
No, I was really glad I talked to you before I did any of this, because you reinforced the reality I would not want to do this on my own. And then as I'm, as Brian's describing, as we went back and forth, and I was like, oh, how would this ever have worked without, someone like Brian to guide me how to do it? So that made a huge difference. I definitely felt like, oh, okay, we're getting into a groove. It's getting better. It's going to be good.
Yeah.
And you took the NyQuil too, Vicky. Or Phyllis.
God. Oh, I posted that.
Yeah. Well, so this was one of Elizabeth's challenges.
I couldn't let this go without bringing that up.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this was one of her mistakes. It was a good segue to the mistakes to go into the making of an audiobook sometime.
You could have fooled me. I didn't know that even happened until after the fact.
Well, maybe just help tone down your enthusiasm, Elizabeth. Actually, kind of got your pacing in a more. So tell everyone who's here what happened.
So I actually had booked to do this with Brian like very early in the new year. I was quite excited. It was like one of my all right, January, I'm doing the audiobook, and was all set to do it. And then New Year's Eve got whatever plague has been going around the entire country many, many times. And I was completely congested. And my good buddy, Vic, who's also a voice coach for people in radio, she's like, yeah, you can't. Even when I was feeling better, she goes, nah, you sound like nasally. You can't do it. Don't reschedule. So I was like, okay, Brian, I'm not quite there. And so finally I got together with Brian, and I was pretty good, but I had a little bit of congestion, and I knew that coughing was going to just, interrupt anything I was recording. And I thought, well, let me put a lid on that. So I grabbed what I thought was Dayquil as I was running out the door to get to Brian's. And then first thing in the morning after we got settled and he got me set up in the studio, and then I was like, took a swig, and then I looked at the jar and went, oh no, it's NyQuil.
Yeah.
So I'm amazed you hung in as well as you did.
How many coffees can I have?
I dove in on the I was like, when lunchtime came, he's like, do you want to take a break? I'm like, yeah. I think food might help and some more liquids. So I kind of had I don't think I felt particularly great until I got home that evening, but woo, those mistakes.
Because I can really throw you for a loop. I'm amazed, you went right through it the whole day. So we got finished, and it didn't. Like I said, I wouldn't have known. So
Yep. Yep.
Mm.
Brian, what are some of your pieces of advice for authors who are recording an audiobook for the first time to set up for success? I mean, one, obviously don't take NyQuil. So
don't
that's
take
number one.
NyQuil.
Yeah.
That's always a good. That's a definite piece of advice. I would think. I think just realizing that it's it's a bit of a long haul,
Yeah.
and it takes a lot of prep, and it's different from you have to take what's written on the page and translate it
Mm,
for audio. So it's a bit of a long haul. You have to really prep and make sure you prepare as well as you can, so that the process can be as smooth as it can be when you get into the studio. But there are always little things that happen, and you have to have that flexibility also.
mm,
And Elizabeth, I think we encountered that once in a while. You would hit a sentence that
yeah.
maybe you had to make a quick change right on the fly because it didn't translate from the page to the audio version,
Mm,
and we need to maybe just make a quick change there. So flexibility and preparing for the long
mm,
haul, preparing in
yeah.
general, and just having that degree of flexibility about the whole process,
Mm,
and
And
hopefully
just
working with someone who you can. It's a really a joint effort. Like with Elizabeth and
mm,
myself, it was really a joint effort. You were obviously the reader and the author, and I was just there to kind of help things along. But it's sort of like you're going through this thing. It's like a partnership almost,
yeah, it is a
and
collaboration. And you just brought up
collaboration. Yeah,
something that was just a shock to me, is how many typos were in there.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, I
yeah.
I have
No
read
matter,
that book so many times. So many people had read it. It had been gone
yeah,
over by,
Oh, that was the
the
worst.
an editor from
things.
the New York Times.
Yeah,
I mean, it had, serious guns on this thing. And I'm like, how did that get
uh,
through? And so
yeah.
just
It's
really
amazing how
amazing.
things like that slip through the cracks, but they do. You
Yep.
know,
It
it's crazy, but yeah.
Yep. I know I had a pen and like as I was reading the manuscript, so we did an update of the interior afterwards for a few typos, and it's also humbling when you realize you wrote a sentence that you thought like read well, and then you're reading it out loud, and you're like, this is a run on, or this is a mouthful. But I
Yeah.
also I was like, I'm not going to make a ton of those types of changes. I was like, this is just how it is. It could have, and also I did mine a year after I had written and published my book. And so like things might have shifted a little bit of how you say things. I'm like, Karen Martin had good advice for me when I wrote and published my book. She's like, your thinking's going to evolve on how you might explain or
Mm,
say something. It's okay to have your book be a moment in time. And
yeah.
so I was just like, all right, I'm just reading the moment of time. I'm going to correct
Right.
any like errors, but I'm not going to go and edit or change the book. And that was a little humbling as well, but it was good for my perfectionism to just say, nope, that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. That definitely comes up. I'm like, yeah, I would have moved this. I would have, you have
Yeah, I
to
would
let
have
it
done this
go.
differently. And like, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's the way the book is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then
And
we also had the situation in your book, Elizabeth, where you were, reading the quotes from other authors and other contributors, and so
Mm,
that was tricky too. Making sure that we were able to differentiate when it was you reading and you reading their words, and so
mm,
these little things come up depending on the content of
yep.
the text, and you really have to adapt.
Yeah.
I also remember
Yeah.
like just the huge relief when you told me the things I didn't have to read. You were like,
Yeah.
no, we're not going to
We're not
read
doing
that.
the table of contents. We're not doing
We're,
the index. We're
not
not doing the
doing that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just
I
Bore
was like,
people to tears,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
So
no,
yeah,
dude.
no,
Yeah.
you don't have to do that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, for sure. And I think a lot of things, you going back to something you mentioned, Brian, about it's a long haul, it's a long process. My audiobooks, I think about 8 hours in its finished product. It
Mhm,
was 80,000 words. You
mhm,
take at least double, if not more of that time in terms of the actual reading. And, you don't do that all in one day. It's a longer process. There's so many stumbles you make when you're trying to like read it. This is also the benefit of having a really strong audio producer because they tighten you up, they make you sound great.
mhm.
But it is a long process, and it's not just like go in for one day and record the whole thing. Your voice would get worse, and also it's just not. It's
we
more.
did two days of recording, about 3 to 4 hours each session, and then I was about a week and a half on the edit.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a process, and that's really nothing for some audiobooks.
Yeah.
But you got to do yours twice, Katie.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So
what was the story with that? What happened there?
So Brian wants to hear my learning. So Elisabeth took NyQuil, and I recorded my audiobook twice, and it was even more than that. So, this was still, my book came out in July of 2020. So at the thick of the pandemic, and then I knew I wanted to make an audiobook, and at the beginning of 2021 started to dive into that. But it's still like going into a studio was hard. I didn't have childcare. My kids were then first grade and fourth grade. I was homeschooling them. I was just like, how am I even possibly going to do this? And so I decided in some consultation with an audio producer that I found that I could record it actually here in this very room. We did. She said she could post-produce the audio, that, we made sure we set me up with great audio equipment, and we did a whole sound test. And so we're like, actually, this sounds good. And so I proceeded to record the audiobook here in this studio in just segments of chapters at a time, and as much as I could get out. The challenge, well, there are a few mistakes. I actually went on to Mark Graban's podcast, My Favorite Mistake, and really went into depth on this situation. So I'm not going to totally repeat the thing here, but go back and listen to that episode, because I really reflect on some big learnings. But I wanted to release the audiobook at the 1-year anniversary of the print version's release. And so we were gearing towards that. I had like a month of, marketing and, getting excited for it. Comes out, and also once you write your book, you actually never want to read it again. And so recording it's a whole challenge. And then I didn't want to go back and listen to my audiobook after I recorded it. I did some spot tests and they sounded fine, but I didn't have my team go back and listen to it. Well, my husband, actually he hadn't read my book because he's an audiobook listener. So he's like, we're on the airplane coming back from a trip a week after my book came out. And he's like, you need to listen to this. The quality isn't that good. And there was a big chunk, and it sounded like I was in a bathroom, super echoey. And I was like, really? Oh my God, this is not the quality that I want. And it passed all of Audible's quality controls and all of this. And I went back to my,
because that's not easy to do.
No. And
no, so seriously, hitting those specs is tough.
Yeah. And so it hit the specs. And so this also gave me this chance to so first I went back, we landed, I listened, I'm emailing my audio producer, and she's like, yeah, there were a few places where the audio wasn't as good of a quality, but I figured if it passed the audio, so she never flagged this to me, which was a huge mistake on her part. And the long story, and I went into the whole thing with Mark. We did try to fix things on the back end. We ended up, the root cause that we realized was that in a few cases, some sections of my book, I hadn't chosen the good mic, and it had gone through the native mic on my laptop, which just doesn't capture the same level of quality.
No, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, so
it's you're talking night and day.
Oh, it's 9 days, and it's jarring. So if that happened on a podcast for a 30-minute episode, you would kind of just be like, oh, that wasn't the greatest quality. It was fine. But it's jarring when the quality shifts, and your customers expect when they purchase something, they expect a good quality sound. So it did pass Audible's test, but it wasn't the quality I wanted for my listeners. And some of them had flagged that to me. So I had this huge panic, and I was like, what are we going to do? Long story short is that I decided that I either had to accept the quality how it was, and that's just how it was going to be, or I was going to re-record it and go find a studio. And like Elisabeth, I thought, where's the studio going to be? Turned out there was a great producer 25 minutes from my house, Jermaine Hamilton. He does all of the audiobooks for professors at Stanford and Liz Wiseman and Multipliers. And he had a 3-day spot for me just 2 weeks later. And so I cleared my calendar. I went in and we redid it. And so there was a 2-month gap between releasing the audiobook with the poorer quality, and I couldn't take it down. There was all these back end problems, and the new one coming up. So I learned a lot. My producer learned a lot. She told me she didn't want to disappoint me by not meeting the deadline of my 1-year anniversary. And I realized, like, as a leader, I hadn't clarified my expectations that quality was number one, timeline was number two. And so it really just like, it reminds us that we have to be really explicit on what's most important, and then really communicate as well. So it got fixed.
Sure.
And I really appreciated going in, as we talked about here, going into a studio to work with a producer in a good sound quality. It was, and so when Elisabeth was contemplating, should she record at home or make the investment of time and money to work with a producer in a studio, I said, hands down, just do it. You're going to get a better result all around, and the process is going to be better for you and a better outcome for your listeners. So
It's a shame too, because it sounds to me like what might have happened, not to, rehash but the microphone, the good mic, it could be that one day to the next, maybe those settings in your computer
exactly,
changed
they
and you
switched.
didn't know,
I didn't
and then
know.
you were recording for
Yes,
the
yes,
computer
yes,
laptop audio,
yes.
and that those kinds of things can happen, and that's such a shame. But it's great that you were able to make the commitment to get in there and just
Yeah,
do it right, because you're
yep,
absolutely right. The quality, I mean, there are a lot of things that matter, pacing and the delivery and inflections and all that, but overall quality, it really does matter a lot.
yes.
You want to make that as good as you can in
I
every
gotta
way.
say, I gotta bring up something that Katie just reminded me of. So you just said your husband didn't read your book.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
only listens. Okay. So I got asked to go do a keynote at Kinexus that Mark Graben is connected to. And, I sent a book ahead of time to Greg Jacobson, who's the CEO. And he very kindly said to me, "That's nice of you, but I don't really read books. I only do them on audio." And I had in my head and I was like,
Oh,
I'd given up the idea of doing a audiobook a while back, thinking I was going to have to fly to LA to go to some studio. And I
yeah,
was like, yeah, I don't have time for that. I don't have money for that. And then when I realized, oh, people aren't going to all read this. There's people that only are going to listen. Then I was like, okay, so I got to figure this out.
yeah,
So I'm going to have to come back to Greg Jacobson and say, hey, it's on audio now.
yeah. Now I gotta be promoting it. But yeah, it's so
Yeah.
I'm paired, so I have a podcast now, Chain of Learning, and I double check every time it's chosen. Like I'm not repeating that mistake again, because it was
Yeah.
it was a big lesson. But I'm really grateful I was able to make the correction, and appreciated people giving me the feedback. It wasn't always what they expected, and it was a
Yeah.
good lesson for my first producer about her role also was to flag problems to me,
Yeah.
so that I could make that decision, rather than her making it for me and hiding the mistake. So again, make
Right.
mistakes visible, make problems visible, so you can have a conscious decision.
Okay. Another thing to make visible would be another winner.
Yes, another winner. Okay, so Brady's going to choose another person. So if you are new here to listening in and you didn't say where you're from, please put that in there. Brady's going to take a look. Our audiobook giveaway bundle is only available to people in the United States or have a US Audible account. So put that in there.
All
All
right. And
right.
I actually saw the promo codes I got. They gave me a bunch that were for the UK.
Yes, I don't have any more UK ones. So if you
Okay.
that's it.
Well,
Elizabeth,
we're limited. It's
we're
US
limited, but
only,
you should
people.
contact Elizabeth, and she might be doing additional giveaways for those of you in the UK.
In the
So
UK, but I didn't see any UK people. I saw
yeah.
I saw
All right, great.
Canada,
Well,
but I didn't see UK.
so Brian, I think we're going to shift on to talking about our authentic voice. Elizabeth, do you want to have a chat together? Should we?
Yeah, Brian, we're going to talk about I think sort of the mix. Ooh, the next winner is Vicky Merrick.
All right, Vicky.
All right, good, Vicky.
Vicky in the house.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, thank you. Yeah, so Brian, I want to thank you for coming on and talking about the experience and the studio aspect of this. Katie and I are going to jump into this next section, which is about just as she's describing the different ways to use our voice in other parts of our professional career.
It's
So
great.
once
Great to
again,
have
All right.
you, Brian.
yeah,
Thanks for sharing
Great to
your
be here.
perspective.
Thanks.
And anyone on the East Coast, go contact Brian if you're working on your audiobook.
and on your way to
So
working with Brian, you can play some bocce with me on the way
Oh,
to talk to
all
Brian.
right.
So it's a
there
bonus.
you go. It's a
Yeah.
win-win.
It's a win-win.
All
So,
right.
Thank you, Brian, so
thanks,
much.
guys. It was great to do
You're,
this. Yeah.
yeah, you're welcome. Now I have
Yeah.
to figure out how do there we go. Bye, Brian.
Yeah.
Bye, Brian.
All right. So, yeah, we learn from our mistakes. And I mean, that's all we can do, right? And so we can learn from our mistakes. And I'm glad, Elisabeth, you were able to also learn from my mistake. And now you're paying it forward and reminding people to check out your Dayquil versus NyQuil in the next situation. So we are paying it forward to everyone here. So we wanted to talk about, as Elisabeth and I were preparing for this, we realized that audiobooks and even writing often are also about how do you develop your authentic voice? How do you share your authentic voice? And I had some realizations recently because I was looking at me as a speaker, as a keynote speaker, and listening to some of my clips, and then had some videos of me teaching a workshop or a breakout session, and I was aware that I was speaking in a different cadence and rhythm. And I've been thinking about this too, about when I record my podcast and other ways. So we thought, let's talk about how our authentic voice can stay real, but shifts depending on the context.
And I'm going to bring up to begin, just because Vicki Merrick just won a book, which I'm very excited about because she's laid up for a bit, and this will give her something to do. But I also want to talk about, as a voice coach, I have read things aloud to her, right? So keynote speeches, things like that. And I think, Katie, you talked about it a little bit when you're talking about reading your book after, some time passed after having written, and you're thinking, I thought I was writing really tight sentences here. And what is this? Like, how is this like, habla, habla? Like, why am I? And I read things to Vic, and she said, you're kind of sticking on that one part. Can you find another way to say that? Like, that sentence doesn't really flow. So there's this aspect of, and I've done like for memorials, what I was going to read aloud there. And as I just mentioned most recently for keynotes, but that brings back to, I think, something you were talking about, Katie, which is, what is it's kind of like the level of animation, right?
Yeah. And sort of authority at which you're speaking as well. Yeah.
And I think, and the difference. So keynote, obviously, and then it's different too. Are you up on a stage and are you 50 feet from, 20 feet from people, whatever it is? Are you in a room that's, you have a little bit of a division? Yeah. I mean, I've been on stage too. I mean, I obviously have a background in improv, and, it was a smaller space. So you could be a little bit quieter there, but it was like, okay, you're not on a movie set. You actually have to project. So how do you project and then, still maintain your authenticity and the engagement and interest of the people you're talking to?
Yeah. So when I was listening, and I've been having this observation too with when I do my podcast, but that my observation I had was just a few weeks ago, I was listening and watching some of my main stage keynote addresses. And these are to audiences of like multiple hundreds to 2,000, actually, when I was in Brazil. And you're taking up a huge space. And so you have to have this like totally different like presence in the way you're storytelling and animating. And I heard a different cadence. And then I had a video of me recently leading a 4-hour leadership retreat for one of my clients. And I was still actually on a stage. But I talked in a slightly more casual way, in a little bit more intimate way than on the main stage. And I was sharing many of the same messages, but just the way, and it was my authentic message, but it was the way that I was, as you said, the energy and the projection and sort of the level of authority maybe. So I thought it was interesting because I was like, I want to do clips of these, but I need to be clear that some are like my main stage keynotes and the others are breakout session workshop type of retreat, Katie. Because different clients are looking for different things, and I can do both. They just have to be clear on which is the way of delivery. And it's the same thing with recording the audiobook. You don't want to just read the pages. You need to animate the story, and kind of like I listened to a few people's audiobooks to kind of get the like what appealed to me, even though I was an audiobook listener, like what kind of style appealed to me? Because then I tried to like replicate that in my own authentic way.
Yeah. And I think the difference between our books, mine has a lot more humor. Not that Mr. Yoshino can't tell a good joke, but I'm just saying he was trying to explain.
Yeah. It was more
a little more weighty
yes
aspects, and I might have been dealing with weighty aspects, but I was doing it usually with a sense of humor.
Yeah.
So being able to be myself, that the way I would normally have told that joke, or how I would just get across the levity, but it still be authentic. And the other thing I was thinking about with the stage, even though I think, like, to your point, you're projecting, you're broadcasting, you've got to be have big energy. You also, I think, can use silence. I think that's incredibly powerful, especially when you're up on stage. Like those can be moments.
Yes. And when taking those pauses when you read too, or you're recording an audiobook, so there's natural pauses, but not too long, but between sections. And just so there is like a moment of that. I've one of my reflections recently when I had the 1 year mark of my podcast Chain of Learning. And it was amazing to me how starting a podcast with intention. I've been recording audio formats and interviews for years and years and years, but I wanted a different format for my new podcast Chain of Learning. And for my solo episodes, I found that in the beginning I needed to write them out, and then so I was sort of reading them in the same audiobook format style. But I realized a podcast like is the listening, you don't want it to be an audiobook. You want it to feel like almost more spontaneous. And so it's been interesting because like when I haven't, like how we're having a conversation here, we have a few bullet points of topics, but we are riffing off the top of our head here. And so I've been really pushing myself to not write everything out for my solo episodes, but have enough structure that I'm not going off the rails and so freewheeling, but also it is more spontaneous. And also, how do I, on the parts that I am reading, how does it also be more spontaneous and not audiobook style? So it's been very interesting to observe both hearing, it is important to go hear yourself because that's an important way to learn, but also to observe in ourselves how we talk and how we communicate, and then how that lands in different formats. So you always want to retain your authenticity of who you are, but what's the best method and style of communicating to resonate and connect with your audience?
You bring up a mistake I made early on with Tracy's and my podcast, the Just in Time Cafe, our first guest ever. And I had given him the questions, which I was later, chastised. Do not, give people the questions, give them, generally the theme, whatever you're going to talk about. And he had a prepared answer and was reading it. And it was kind of, zero energy, reading a red piece. And so we had to, be working with guests carefully to make sure they were comfortable, the topics, kind of where we're going, but we're not going to give you, and the conversation is going to go where it goes. The other aspect you just mentioned, which is writing stuff down, and working with two aspects of this. One of them was writing stuff down, but trying to keep it light so that Tracy and I could go. And Tracy much happy. I'm the improv person, but Tracy way happier to just go. I just put a little bracket going, expand.
She's like, woo!
Here we go. The other thing is back to the audio things we brought up with Brian and what happened to you is Tracy and I have to set our levels every time. And so that's an immediate, like, okay, how high are you? All right, you sound a little loud. How about you bring you down? I'll bring up, okay, we'll meet in the middle. All right, we're good.
Yeah.
But both those things, trying to keep it level, but live.
So I want to make sure we get some, if anyone who's here live and has some questions, please put your questions or observations, comments, whatever it is in the chat. I see I see a crying, laughing face from Diane. I think that was from the NyQuil story there. Yeah, and thanks, Thomas, for saying it's a really good session. I'd love to hear what's resonating with you and what you've enjoyed about it. So please put any comments, questions in the chat here. Again, if you are listening after the live session too, please put your questions in here too. Elizabeth and I will be going back through the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions in written format as well. So,
and I think, Brady, it's time for another winner.
The third and final bundle winner. So, all right. So in a moment, Brady will let us know who that winner is. And I just want to say as well that, Elizabeth, huge congratulations for the release of your audiobook and for continued impact with your stories. I loved the book. I love the book. I loved being part of the book and helping you think about how to really pull the different parts together, continuing to revise it to make it most effective. And even if you're listening to the audiobook of Picture Yourself a Leader, I encourage you to pick up a hard copy, your paperbook copy, because Elisabeth has drawings that she made for each chapter that go along with the story. So really, even though the story is great and you can listen to her tell it, go and check out those drawings. They're really fun and humorous, and they really stick with you as well. So, all right, our third and final winner is
Thomas
Bertels. So again, if you can please share your information with Elisabeth in LinkedIn on a messenger, we will send you codes for your books. All right. So Ruth has a question for us. She has I have an odd kick in my gallop. I blank at different times, even when repeating. How would you deal with hiccups? Not
kick in my gallop. Blank at different times.
I don't know. I'm not totally sure what that means, Ruth. Could you expand on your question? We'll go to Bob's question here. What challenges you have converting the drawings into audio format? Well, that's a great question, because that sparked some conversation a few weeks ago.
It is.
And me.
It's great. So Bob, with yours, with your question, what I ended up deciding was to not incorporate the illustrations, but because I also recognized when I read the book stood on its own, and there weren't anything referencing aside from, what Audible caught was that I had written something like in the introduction or the description was with blah, blah, blah illustrations, illuminating. And they're like, do you want to include those? And I was like, oh no. And that would be, I think, to my feeling, for the reader or listener, that would be disjointed. Like, okay, I'm listening to a story, and they're 5-minute stories, right? So you don't want to go, okay, where's the picture of this? Where's the illustration? Okay, now I'm going back. So I didn't, but I will say, someone recently I was working with, because I'm working now on a field book to go with the Picture Yourself a Leader. And
cool.
As you know, Bob, and the woman I was working with said, in some cases, the illustration gives you a better idea of the story than the title. So I'm taking that to heart. I'm like, okay, I got to work on this and see how does that play out. Okay. And thank you for that.
Yeah. And then one way I dealt with that is I said at the beginning of the audiobook, there are graphics that go along with some of these. You can go find them at, wherever. And there's some pictures, and you can go get those in the audiobook. There were some times where I had a section where I was describing something, and I would say there is a graphic that goes along with this if you go and view the print version. So just when it made sense. Other times I just when there were pictures that just, it didn't matter one way or the other, it was just an added bonus, I just didn't mention it as well. So I guess there are different ways to deal with that. But I too did not include graphics or anything in my audiobook. I figure if people are drawn or wanting that visual as an anchor, they'll go back and get the actual printed book as well.
Yeah, that was a good ad. I'm gonna have to call Brian Morris and make an addendum. So Ruth said pauses at odd times would be a hiccup. So this is in terms of because Ruth also an author, if you were reading aloud, you have odd pauses. But then I think when you have a producer,
Yeah,
they can remove those pauses, Ruth.
Yeah, they edit that. They make you tighter. Like I have a really strong audio producer for my podcast. I used to just like have a very light edit, which is almost like the raw, and just cut out big things. But I have a audio producer who, in the same way, goes through and tightens things up in my interviews and in my solo episodes, because I want a stronger listening experience for my podcast Chain of Learning. It's just a different level of quality. So I wouldn't worry about that. That's why you have a producer who helps you. And then it's okay if you have some pauses that are times like when you're talking naturally. It's okay. That's sort of what being a natural human being and authentic is all about. And so it's okay. Being okay with our imperfections as well.
Yeah. No, that's the beauty of editing.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you can't edit. Like when we're not going to post-production edit this. So you'll get our awkward pauses and more. But I'm totally with you. When there's a lot more stronger editing. I know my podcast editor has to do with my solo episodes, because I stumble more than if I'm just having a casual conversation, because you're trying to get the concept right.
Yeah.
So it's just also a different, I guess, personal intention about the format. So it's interesting.
Yeah. No, it also just speaks to the power of collaboration.
Yes.
Right. You have another human being there. It's like this, a flow, and it's easier, and you've got a little bit of a tougher row if it's on your own.
As I always say, 1 + 1 = much more than 2.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah.
So Thomas is asking, I think, Elisabeth, you have my info. And I would say, Thomas, as they say, I know where you live.
Oh, all right. So we are winding down here. We've had 3 audiobook bundle giveaways of Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And picture yourself. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yes. And picture yourself a leader. Da, 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 da. And congratulations. Thank you all for joining us live to celebrate the release of Elisabeth's audiobook. To hear our lessons learned about the process of recording audiobooks. Thank you to Brian Morris for joining us to share insights from the producer's standpoint, and thinking about how do you put forward your authentic voice, no matter what format it is, and what's going to be the style and the way that you speak or write that's going to best connect your message with your desired audience. And I think that's really important for us as leaders, as facilitators, as coaches, as consultants, as human beings. How do we communicate in the most effective way, and how do we adjust our approach so that we can convey the points that we want and connect? So,
and don't be afraid to call on a colleague, a friend, maybe a voice coach if you get access to one, who you can read aloud to if you want to test something out, right? So get practice, get feedback. It's really it's vulnerable, but it's really helpful to do that aloud.
And get comfortable listening to yourself as well. I mean, I really don't like listening to myself, but I've gotten better at it, because you hear the that you hear these things. And so that's part of continuing to hone your delivery in whatever format so that your message can be best heard and understood by your audience.
Well said.
Yes. So on that front, again, huge congratulations to Elisabeth Swan for the release of Picture Yourself a Leader audio format. And thank you all for joining us. Again, if you weren't here live, add your questions in, your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Elisabeth and I will be coming back. You can we'd also love for you to connect with us here on LinkedIn, or subscribe to our YouTube channels, and listen to our podcast, the Just in Time Cafe, which is Elisabeth and Tracy's podcast, and Chain of Learning, which is my podcast. And of course, our books, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, and Picture Yourself a Leader. So thank you all, and have a fantastic day. Elisabeth, it's such a pleasure to collaborate with you and be your friend.
Same to you, Katie. And thanks everybody for showing up. It was awesome to see you.